Hi, Sarah. Welcome to the podcast today.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. It's good to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on because you're involved in so many different topics that are near and dear to my heart as like an aspiring writer, um, and uh, it, I'm especially my daughter is very happy that I'm interviewing you today because you are one of her teachers.
Yeah, that's so fun. I when I first started writing, I thought, "Oh, I better keep my writing life separate from my teaching life because I don't know what the people at school are going to think about what I'm writing." But it's sort of gradually started to merge I haven't gotten too much pushback yet. So I think it's working out okay.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
Uh, as you say that, one of the things that I've thought about as I do a podcast interview is, yeah, what would like a client think of like the things that I share? But um, I think uh, part part of writing and just putting words out into the world is like being ourselves and
Mhm.
just being authentically us.
Yep.
And so um, she she appreciates my daughter Grace appreciates you as a teacher,
Yeah,
and
I
yeah,
appreciate her too. We've been doing this virtual poetry club that she's popped into the last few meetings, and we just had our last one this past Tuesday, and she stayed after. Well, there was only one other student, but he left, and she stayed. She said, "I just want to talk to you for a little bit more," and so she had a poem that she loved that she wanted to share with me, that was just a really sweet ending to our poetry club. So I'm so glad she was able to come to that.
nice. So before we dive into your story, could you share with listeners a little bit about yourself, your background?
Yeah, so I am in the hat wearing phase of life. You know that old picture book of the guy who had 40 hats on his head? Do you remember that book?
Is that a Dr. Seuss where he keeps taking
No.
them off?
Oh, there is that Dr. Seuss book. Yes, Bartholomew Cubbins and the 500 Hats. But no, I'm thinking of there's a guy he's trying to sell caps for sale is the name of it. He's trying to sell caps and then he goes to sleep under a tree and the monkeys have come and stolen all of his caps. Anyway,
I'm picturing it.
yeah,
I grew up in the 70s. I think I
yeah,
remember that one.
right. We're in the same general era. So I just feel like I'm in that like wearing a pile of 40 caps phase of life. So my husband is a pastor, so I've got pastor's wife, whatever that means. I'm a teacher. I teach. I try to make it part time at Alliance Charter Academy, where your daughter goes. Although they've asked me to add a couple more classes next year, so it keeps being less and less part, and it's not quite full yet. But I'm really trying to keep my arms around that one so that I have time to do the other things that I need to do. So, pastor's wife, teacher. I have four kids. They are 16, 14, 12, and 9. And right now we are in the thick of, I feel like we've got a year off from so many things. I got a year off from driving
All
my
the
kids around.
activities, driving
Right. Yeah.
everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah. All the sports, it was all canceled. So it's all back. And this last weekend, I was with my daughter. She was running track districts in Madras. And then this weekend, I was with her. She was running state in Florence. And then in the meantime, my son has been rowing and he's going to nationals in June. So they just started 5:30 a.m. practices. So I took him every morning to that. So,
Wow.
and then my other two play baseball. So just, like track mom, rowing mom, baseball mom. I mean, I don't, that's enough, right? I don't, if there's anything else, I can't even remember what it is. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's it.
The with the pandemic, things kind of slowed down. How, and you can go into this as deep as you like. Um, how was pastor's wife role and or ministry for this pandemic for your church?
Well, it's been tough. I think that part of in the beginning it was good because it was that breath of rest for all of us. Nobody was expecting much. We were all like,
Mm.
oh my goodness, we have to stay in our houses. Um, and so like last year, I think for the first time in my life, or maybe for the first time since my daughter was like 2, my husband was home on Mother's Day morning, right? Like,
Oh,
because
okay.
he's always off preaching. Mother's Day is always Sunday, and
Yeah.
and so for the first time, and my kids are old enough; they can do it by now. But it was nice to have him around. And Father's Day, same thing. Oh my gosh, you're here! We can celebrate you on Father's Day. So that
Mm.
was nice. But then the stress of wait a second, like when are we going back, and what does that mean, and how do we stay connected to the people in our community?
Mm.
um, Political challenges of oh, we're over here and you're over here, and that never used to matter, but all of a sudden it does. It's been challenging. I feel like we're starting to find a way back. um, we've started to meet in our space again. We're starting to discover that people are still around in our community, which is good. For a while there, it was like, oh no, we might have just like lost everyone. Who's even
Who,
still out there watching
who's
you?
gonna come back? Yeah,
Yeah.
who's watching? Who's
So we're
listening?
figuring that out. Yeah. But it's been
Mm.
it's been
Mhm.
challenging. Yeah.
Yeah. With the stresses and challenges of busyness and or even like criticism or conflict from community, um, how does that affect your writing? Does it make it harder or does it make it easier?
Um,
Give you more to
yeah,
write about.
that's a good question. And I'm also realizing that someone's practicing piano right now. Do you want me to tell them to stop, or is it okay? I don't know if you
Well,
can even hear it.
I don't hear them,
Oh, good.
so
Okay.
like background music would be fine too. So
Okay, fine. Good. I think at some point there was a box I could check, like, do you want to filter out background noise? I think I checked it. So hopefully we're good.
yes,
Um,
Grace rehearses sometimes
okay.
during
All right.
podcasts. So
Good.
yeah.
Yeah. Kids, they do their thing. It's great. Piano mom, a band mom. I could have added those hats to my list. So okay, now that totally distracted me and I've lost the thread. What was your question? Can you
Oh,
repeat it?
just how does stress and busyness like affect your writing?
Yeah. Well, the beginning of the pandemic, I felt like I couldn't write at all. I just felt like my brain had been like fritzed. I don't know. It was like I don't know if I was just consumed with worry about what was going to happen. I mean, it really felt sort of apocalyptic, like the world was going to end. Um, I couldn't write.
Mm.
I couldn't read. I felt like all I could do was like doom scroll on my phone, like what is the bad news that's coming to me through Twitter?
Yeah.
Um, but I read an article at the beginning of the pandemic. Um, I wish I could find it again. I don't even remember who it was. Written by a woman who had lived through war zones, and she wrote about the experience of living in trauma. And she said, "Your brain is going to be there waiting for you when you get to the end of this." And she said, "The first thing you need to do in this time, this critical first time, is organize your space." And she had like all these very practical lists of like how to live through a traumatic experience, which I think we don't really have that
Mm.
much experience with in America. Like everything for many of us sort of seems like it's fine all the time. And there are these other countries where they've sort of collectively learned how to live through traumatic situations. So
Mm.
um, anyway, it was a really great article. And the other thing she did in that article was she said, clearly it's not going to be over in 2 weeks. It's going to be 18 to 24 months long. Like, I don't know how she knew, but she said that. And that kind of lodged in my brain, like, okay, it's going to be 18 to 24 months long. And the first thing I need to do is organize my space. So I did. I cleaned out the basement. I reorganized like whose room was where. I painted all the rooms in the house. I mean, I just like things that had been bugging me.
Wow.
We've been living in this house for 6 years. I've never had time, right? You know, you sit down and you look at the wall, you're like, I hate that it's that color, but I never have time to do anything about it. So at the beginning of the pandemic, I really focused on that. I think there was like one day where I was able to say, wow, the house, every single thing in the whole house is totally where it's supposed to be. And of course, like it didn't last more than one day, but
You've
there
got
was
4
one day.
kids.
Yeah. Anyway, so after that process took a few months. And after that, it really was true that parts of my brain started to kind of come back online or reorganize in different ways. And I have been able to start writing again. But yeah, it took a while. It was hard.
Yeah. The you've written uh, for journals, for blogs, and you've written a book, or are in the process of writing a book.
Actually, I've written a whole book, and now I'm working on a second book, even
Wow.
though I couldn't get the first book published. So it's like, that's been hard. That was part of the I can't write. Okay, so backing up. So I have a whole big story that I'll tell you. But a big crazy thing happened to me. I felt like I had to write it down. I spent probably 5 years trying to write that story down. I went and got my Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing. I finished writing that story. I was for sure that I was gonna, go out and publish it. I got an agent. She worked really hard. And it was right as the pandemic was starting that our efforts to sell that book were winding down. We got some great feedback from publishers. Some of them said, one editor said, I did things for this book that I've never done for any other book. Like I really went to bat for it. But ultimately they said, your platform's too small. So that was discouraging, but then also it felt like the whole world was falling apart. And so I was like, well, I guess I don't really have time to worry about that book too much because like the whole world is collapsing.
Got to survive. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's been pretty much exactly a year. I was talking to a friend on the phone last May, and she said, Sarah, like if your first book doesn't sell, what are you going to write about next? And I said, well, like it's weird. I feel like I need to write about racism. And the following week, George Floyd died. And I was like, oh my God, like, I need to take it back. Like, I'm not qualified to speak into this. There were so many people saying so many important things. And it was like, never mind. Like, I can't touch this topic. But it just stayed with me and it didn't go away. And so I just started reading and praying and kind of trying to zero in on like, well, if I was going to write about this, what would I write? And it's really been in the last couple months that it has started to coalesce for me. And I've started to see like, oh, this is what it is. And so I have this whole second book that now I'm actually really excited about. And it's interesting to me that if I had published the first one, I never would have gotten here, or I wouldn't have gotten here as fast because I would have still been on the track of like, okay, let's do the edits and let's go out and whatever you have to do to sell a book. But because that one was set aside, this whole other thing is now opened up. So, but it was hard to take the step of like, well, I spent tons of money and time and, pushing my family's needs aside to write this whole first book.
Yeah.
And it turns out no one wanted it. And now I'm going to go and do it again, even though maybe no one wants the next one either. Like,
That's daunting.
yeah, it was.
Yeah.
But we'll see what happens. Maybe they'll both get published. Maybe neither of them will be published. Who knows?
Yeah. I remember Donald Miller.
Mhm.
He uh blew like jazz, like blew up and
Yeah,
was huge.
yeah.
But that wasn't his first book.
Mm,
Um,
mhm.
I think he'd written one or two before then,
Yeah.
and that first book, which I enjoy, um, uh, like I think he like republished it or
Uh-huh.
put a new cover on it, and um, and it helped that by the author of Blue Like Jazz, so it's on the bottom
Yeah,
of it.
now people will read
Yeah,
it.
yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
that's um the theme of our podcast is one of them is about courage,
Mhm.
and just the courage to write
Yeah.
and persevere
Yeah.
through the the first one not getting published. Can you tell the story a little bit
Yes. Yes.
of the
No,
first one? Because
I can.
like with all the work that you did with it, I would just love
Yeah.
to hear. I don't know if I've mentioned it to you before. I wrote a book. It's been 5 years ago now,
Mm,
and uh, it's like I went into it knowing like they always tell you like your first one is not your best one, or like
yeah.
you make all the mistakes and all that. And so I chose to like write it about parenting
Mm,
because I love my kids and I'm passionate about parenting, but I'm not a parenting expert.
uh-huh.
So I wrote it with the idea that like I'll be the rookie writer and make all the mistakes on this one, because
There you
that's not the book I want to write. I want
go.
to write a book about marriage and marriage counseling and a book about love. Um, but when you write a book, you it's like your baby, like it is a child, like it is important to you.
It's
You
a,
can't.
yeah.
It's not unimportant.
Yeah. Yeah.
So like I started out with it like kind of like a little tongue in cheek,
Mm,
like the topic, uh, but then when you remember the stories and tell the stories about your family and your kids,
mhm.
like it's
Yeah.
it's gonna be real. So
Yeah. Yeah.
so um I I'm resonating and feeling empathy,
Mhm.
Sarah, for that first book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and it was just it was a story that I had to tell because this huge thing happened to me and I just had to tell it. So I'll tell you, I'll try to tell you in a short form that doesn't take a whole book. So basically the sort of like step into the action moment is 12 weeks after my fourth child was born. I started to have these obsessive thoughts.
Mm,
And I had had obsessive thoughts in the past and had actually gone to a counselor, but could never actually bring myself to be honest with the counselor about what the obsessive thoughts were. So that counseling never really went anywhere. Um, so this time around, it was very upsetting to me. Uh, so basically, I was afraid I was going to have an affair, and I just couldn't stop thinking about this one particular other person. And I knew that I was supposed to confess it to my husband, and I really didn't want to. I just
mm,
kept praying that it would just go away. And um, I was doing a Bible study one day, and it was on there's a verse in Second Corinthians that I really should have the chapter and verse number in my mind, but I don't. But it's the verse that says, I will, it's about boasting in our weakness.
mm,
Yeah, I can't even rattle off the exact words for you right now, but it's about boasting in our weakness. And the Bible study said, how can you do this today? It's like, oh my gosh, like I have to write something down in that space. I would
mm,
really like to think of a different weakness that I could boast about, but I can't even think of anything right now. All I can think about is this thing that's been like in my head for weeks.
mm,
And And here's this question that says, how can you do this today? I'm like, today? Okay, I'll do it today. So I confess this to my husband. It's a Thursday night, and I'll there's a lot to the story. I'll try to condense it a little bit, but basically by the following Tuesday, it was almost as if confessing that made space for other stuff to bubble up that I didn't
Mm.
even know was there.
Yeah.
So 4 days later, Tuesday morning, um, all of a sudden, I'm changing my baby. He's lying there on the changing table, and I look at him, and these words just plow into my brain, totally unexpected, never thought them before. So surprising. I actually like stumbled backwards and fell on the bed.
Mm.
And the words were, something happened to me. Something happened to me when I was a baby. I was sexually abused by, and then this name. That had never occurred to me before, that I had been sexually abused. Like, what? Where did that come from?
Mm.
So that was Tuesday morning, and it kind of spun me into this, like, oh my gosh, I got to figure this out, trying to, rethink my entire life. By Thursday night, so 1 week after I first confessed these thoughts to my husband, I had to be taken to the psych ward, and I was hospitalized. So, like, majorly dramatic, like total life altering,
Totally disrupted your
totally
life.
totally disrupted my life. I ended up being diagnosed with um, postpartum psychosis, and then they converted it to bipolar disorder, and then it took a few years to add on the diagnosis of OCD. I think the obsessive thoughts were part of that.
Yeah.
So all of that, I'm in the hospital for 4 days, and then they just, give me enough medication to sort of like squash all that stuff.
Mm.
And then,
And for you, Sarah, like the medication, did it just turn down the volume and the intensity of it, or did it help with the actual like intrusive thoughts?
it just turned everything down. Just everything just kind of went away. And I think that medication it was the wrong medication. It was too much. Within a couple months,
Mm.
my husband was like, what has happened here? Like, I can't, I wasn't really talking.
Mm.
I was sort of becoming kind of catatonic. Um,
Wow.
so we tried a different medication, and it was better. But so that whole year, it was like, first there was all this obsessive thought stuff, then this explosive revelation, then I was hospitalized, then I was turned into a zombie, then I started to come out of it, and then I had to ask the questions, okay, was I really abused? What do I do with that relationship now? Someone who's still in my life. And what is this mental illness stuff? Like, no one's ever told me I had a mental illness before. What do I do with that?
Yeah.
So it
You're
was a
wrestling,
year.
you're wrestling with all that, and I'm doing the math.
Yeah.
So 9 years ago, so you had around 7-year-old, 5-year-old, 3-year-old, and a baby.
Yeah. And actually, it was in the fall. None of them had turned yet. So they were 6, 4, and 2.
Oh
And then,
wow.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was, that's enough, right? Like, anybody could go to the psych ward just for having a 6, 4, 2 and newborn, right? Like,
Yeah.
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 Well,
So it was a lot.
yeah. What
Yeah.
was that like for your church community and your husband?
So we were living in a different city. He was an associate pastor at the time. And there were people who really came around. Majorly stepped into our lives and said, we are going to love you through this. We are going to help you through this.
Hmm.
And then there are people who didn't. And I think a lot of times mental illness is scary. I think people don't know what they're supposed to say or do, and so they kind of like, like, I better kind of put you at arm's length because I'm scared. Um, but the church, I mean, they gave Jeremy a paid month off when I was first hospitalized. They helped pay for my medications that now they're generic. They're $5 whenever I go in to refill. But that before they went generic, it was like $100 a month, and which
Wow.
seemed like a lot more at the time, like
Oh
back
yeah.
then. Yeah.
Yeah.
When we were, I was staying home and he was an associate pastor's salary. It was like, what? How, we can't do that.
Mm.
So yeah, so they were supportive. Many of them were supportive. Some were not. That's the way it goes.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm. So a year of at least the start of trying to figure out the right medication
Right.
and or even
Yeah.
the right
Yeah.
diagnosis and treatment
All of that.
plan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I was very resistant when I first, I'd never even seen a psychiatrist before I was in the hospital. And then I came out of the hospital. I remember like walking down the hall to my first psychiatrist appointment. I was like, what kind of people go into doors that say psychiatrist on the front? Like that
Mm.
sounds, like who have I become? I just
Mm.
didn't even had no context for it. And I remember that very first psychiatrist appointment, she was kind of trying to point me in the direction of like, well, 2/3 of women who have postpartum psychosis have bipolar disorder. And so she was kind of trying to point me to like, hey, is this a thing in your life? And
Mm.
I was very resistant to that. No, it was like, no, I there's nothing wrong with me. I just had this revelation. I've, been under a lot of stress, whatever. Like, I'm never going to have this revelation again. This is never going to happen to me again. I don't have a problem, right? And she said, okay, fine. Well, most manic episodes that are unmedicated last 8 months. So if you want to try to go off the medication after 8 months, that's fine. So I was very determined, like, okay, I'm going to be a good patient for 8 months, and then I'm going to go off this medication. I'm never going to have this problem again because, I was 33. I didn't have any chronic health problems at that time at all. It was just so foreign to me. Like something could be wrong with you that can't be fixed. Like, no, that's not how I'm going to live my life.
Mm.
So after 8 months, I, was counting off. And I came to her. I mean, I saw her all along, but after 8 months, I said, all right, it's been 8 months. Can I go off the medication? She said, sure, you can try it. And maybe because I started to taper off the medication, somehow it also seemed like a good idea at the time to confront my abuser. And so I did that. And after that conversation, sorry, they're yelling. They don't remember things like be quiet for an hour. That's hard for them to remember. So after that conversation, I started to become manic again. And I started to feel that like panicky anxiety feeling kind of rising up in me again. And thankfully, this time around, my husband recognized what was going on. He got me into my counselor. It was her day off. Bless her. She came in to meet me on her day off. And she said, do you need to go back to the hospital? And I remember like kind of mad, like, you can put me back in the hospital if you want to put me back in the hospital. I don't usually like, get mad at people. And then I kind of start crying. No, I don't want to go back to the hospital. And so she said, all right, well, let's talk to your psychiatrist. Let's up your dose and let's see if we can keep you home. And I was able to up my dose and stay home. But that experience of recognizing that feeling that was the same, some parts of it were the same as what had happened to me 8 months before. So I went back to my psychiatrist at that time and I said, all right, I really do have bipolar disorder, don't I? She said, yeah. I don't think that it had ever been a question for her. I mean, who knows what she thought, but I came around to it at that time. So I've stayed on my medication ever since. And I haven't had that sort of emergent, urgent episode since then, but I sort of liken it like having bipolar while being medicated feels a little bit like, so when, oh, sorry, the dog, there's so many noises in my house.
You've got a full
um,
house.
oh my gosh. So it sort of feels like when you're in the midst of a manic episode unmedicated, it's like being a boat in a hurricane, and you might just get picked up and thrown into the next county. When you have bipolar and you are medicated, it's sort of like being a boat in a harbor that's tied, to a dock. Like the water level is still going to go up and down, but you're not going to get
swept away with it.
Swept
The ups and downs
away. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I do sometimes notice a little bit of like, oh, I'm a little, am I happy or am I getting a little hypomanic? Oh, I'm a little slow. I'm maybe, tending to be a little bit depressed, but I have a good medication regimen. I have 2 different medications that I take, and I'm thankful for them because they keep me tied to the dock. So, yeah.
Yeah. So your first book is about
It's that story.
going through that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then in the middle of writing that story, I found out that my great, 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 great grandmother wrote a book in 1796 that's considered by historians to be the first autobiographical account of sexual abuse ever written in America. And so I started reading her book and kind of trying to figure out what happened to the child who was abused. And so the book became sort of a braid between my story and that story. And one publisher who rejected it said, it's too ambitious. I thought it was cool.
It sounds amazing.
I think it's amazing. I think it's an amazing story. So let me see if I can find this brick. So I actually went back to Vermont and New Hampshire with my mom, and we found the place where the house was that they lived in, this family where this abuse occurred in 1796. And I plucked this brick out of the hole in the ground, and she actually talks in the book about how her husband would sit in front of the fireplace and look at the fire and kind of like plot his next move. And this is the fireplace that he was looking at. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a cool story. We'll see if anybody ever wants to publish it, and then you can read it. Yeah.
Right. How the process of writing.
Mm-hmm.
And you're still being treated, so it's not just you're writing about something that you went through, but you're writing as someone going through
Mm-hmm.
living with bipolar. How how has it affected your like the management of your emotions or just the rhythms?
I mean, I think that by the time I started trying to write the book, I had already done so much therapy work. I mean, in that first year especially, I had a counselor, I had a psychiatrist, I had a Stephen minister, I had so many friends who were coming around me. God sent me so many people who prayed with me and spoke into my life, and I did a ton of healing work before I started to put the story down on paper. So I don't feel like, sometimes people say, well, writing is therapeutic. I mean, yes, but also by the time I started writing, it was clear I was writing it for an audience, not just for my own like vomit it out onto the page. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Like there's a place for that.
Yeah.
Um, but you do have to go back and relive things, right? If you're going to
Mm,
write it effectively, you do have to sort of like, I sort of close my eyes and imagine what that scene was in
mm,
order to be able to place myself there so I can write it again.
yeah.
There were some hard moments, but by and large, I felt like I had rehearsed the story so many times that it wasn't like I was trying to write it for the very first time.
I
Or
see.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
It, so for you, it was like therapeutic, and for an audience, it wasn't necessarily the therapy.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh,
But yeah, finding the end is hard, right? Like it's hard to
mm,
find the end of a memoir because you're like, well,
mm.
I could write about what happened yesterday, or maybe something will happen tomorrow that will be the end of that book,
Yeah.
So
That's why,
that's
yeah, that's why Anne Lamott keeps writing little books like every
right.
few years.
Here's another installment of my life. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. The uh, for, for part of the counseling that I do with folks is looking at the story of their life
Mhm.
and how their experiences have shaped their view of themselves, um, their view of the world.
Mm.
Uh, how how has what you've gone through, like we started talking about hats,
Mhm.
um, but what have you learned about like identity?
Oh, that's
Yeah.
such a great question. And I've learned so much. It's totally changed the way I am in the world.
Mm,
And I think that the major thing that's just totally flipped for me is that until I had all those experiences, I was constantly trying to please people. I was trying to be perfect. I was trying
mm,
to please my parents. I was trying to please my teachers. I was trying to please God. I was trying to do it all right and get it right and do everything.
mm,
And then I had this experience where I was completely unable to do any of that,
mm,
right? I was a patient in a psych ward. I couldn't even trust whether my own thoughts were correct. I was not viewed by anyone as anything that I'd spent my whole life trying to project.
mm,
And discovering God's grace in that place and discovering that I was beloved
mm,
in that place was so, it totally changed my life.
mm.
And I felt so free after that. It was like, oh my gosh, like I am loved no matter what. And it just, yeah, it was very foundational.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, it was a huge, and it took some time to, put all those pieces together, but yeah, that was it.
Yeah. That um that prompt, the Second Corinthians
Hmm.
verse about your weakness, that
Yeah,
is like just extreme weakness and helplessness,
yeah,
and
yeah,
uh, just needing the help of others.
yeah, yeah.
And
And I yeah, I mean, it's sort of the theme of my life now. It's like, how can I show you how weak and unable I am to pull it all together? Like even in this podcast, it's like, oh, they're playing piano and they're yelling and they're barking. It's like, this is my life. Yeah. But it's good. God is here.
Mm, yeah. It reminds me of the Greatest Showman. Do you guys watch that musical?
I
The
have
Greatest
seen
Showman.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. Like there's a song like "This Is Me"
Mm.
in there. Yeah. The uh, so so tell me and listeners a little bit about your writing. Like what do you like to write? Um. Besides uh these book projects. Um.
You know, I am in the sort of uh I don't know if it's blessed or just obscure position of not needing to rely on the income I make from writing because it's good because I hardly make any. Um, I have a friend who's a freelance writer, and it's a struggle because she needs to be paid to write. Um,
Mm,
and uh, I still get to write whatever I want, and um, I can feel like I can hardly ever find a place to publish it, and they hardly ever pay me. So it's great because I can still write whatever I want. um, and right now I really am focusing on this second book. But I do. I mean, I sort of, I guess I just write what um, comes to me, and then sometimes it comes like I have an essay that's going to be published next month, and I wrote it last fall. My mom invited me to go on a silent retreat with her, and the afternoon of the second day, I just had all these thoughts, and I sat there and wrote them down. And pretty much, there's not a lot of change between what I scribbled in my journal that afternoon and what's going to come out in this journal next month. Um, and then there's other things that, I mean, I've got this piece that I love it, but it's driving me crazy. And I've been wrangling it for years. And I can't figure out, like, what is it trying to say? And, I don't know if it'll ever get into shape. So,
mhm. So so there are things that you'll wrestle with for years. It's not a thing where you have an idea on Monday and then you're done like on Friday. Like,
sometimes it is,
oh, okay.
sometimes it's
Okay.
not. Yeah.
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 Yeah. D- Um uh do you have any advice for listeners who are writers that are wanting to write more or find their voice as writers?
Yeah. So my best writing advice is don't be afraid to start over. And this, I think, for my students too, like,
Mm,
they write a first draft and then they think like, okay, this is it, the thing that I've written, and all I can do is sort of like rearrange these words a little bit. And sometimes the very best thing to do is take that thing, crinkle it up, throw it away, and start again on the exact same piece, whatever it is, but start fresh. Because all that work you did is still there in your mind,
mm,
and if you start again, your mind might have a new way of putting it out there that just works better, that you couldn't see when you were so attached to whatever the words were that you wrote down the first time.
all right.
It's tough, but that's my
I am like gut punching it here.
advice.
The
Sorry.
my my 96,000 words.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Uh, but don't be
Yeah.
afraid to start over.
So my
Yeah.
memoir, the first book that I wrote, I wrote a draft of it before I started my master's degree. I did the MFA program through Seattle Pacific University, which I highly recommend. Um, and so I had this whole draft, and I came into the program thinking like, okay, they're going to help me fix it and get it ready to go, and it's going to be great. And my first year mentor, so it's a 2-year program, you get one mentor for the first year and one mentor for the second year. And my first year mentor worked with me on, a lot of the stuff that I had coming into it, and she was very helpful. And then my second year mentor said, Sarah, you need to start over. And I said, oh, okay, I will. So I did. And I wrote this whole new draft. I kept some pieces, it wasn't like I totally threw away everything, but I basically started over. I kept some pieces, I rearranged it. I had this whole idea, this new structure, like, oh, this is going to be great. And then after I graduated the program, I hired her to continue working with me as an editor. And so about 6 months after I graduated, I sent her this whole new draft. She'd already told me to start over once. Sent her this whole new draft. And I went out to see her. She lives in North Carolina. And I spent some time with her, and we worked on before we got to the working on part, very first time I sat down with her, I hadn't heard from her yet. I'd sent her this draft. She'd read it. She hadn't told me what she thought of it. So we sat down, and she said, well, do you want me to say something nice, or do you want me to be honest? I was just like, honest.
Mm-hmm.
She said, you got to start over again. It's not working. And that like ruthless honesty, hardly anybody will do that for you, right? Like everybody wants you to feel good about what you're doing. So everybody will read your stuff and say like, this is great. And sometimes they're right, but sometimes you just need somebody to say like, honestly, it's gonna be better if you try again.
Mm-hmm.
So I started writing it a third time. I had already written 2 whole drafts of a book. And I'm staying in her house. She's off doing her, stuff. She teaches. And so I'm just like sitting there in her house, and it's quiet, which is obviously a marvel for me. And she would like come back at night and read what I'd written. And the very first day that I did that, I don't know how many words I wrote, gave it to her. She read it. She comes back in the room. She goes, Sarah, this is the best writing I've ever seen from you. So it was like, I finally wrote something, and not that, it's all about what that one person thinks, but I needed, especially because it was such personal material, I just needed to get it out, and then I needed to get it out again. And then I had enough distance from it. Okay, now I can write it in a way that is going to work for the reader. And of course, it still hasn't been published. So maybe the next editor will come along and say, no, actually, whatever. But I don't know.
As you describe that, Sarah, that's so that's a little bit of the overlap between counseling, therapy, and writing.
Mm-hmm.
Some of my favorite people are writers.
Mm-hmm.
My kindred spirits, like either therapists or writers.
Mm-hmm.
Because we 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 use the material of experiences,
Yeah.
and the structures of story, and for a lot of folks, uh, like editing, like writing. Well, first telling the story, like you described in 2 drafts. Like just the first one is just really kind of messy, and
Yeah.
it's just raw.
Yeah.
Um, and then the retelling of it refines it. Kind of it. It's not that the story changes, but the way we tell it changes. It's refined, and it's actually like redemptive, that like the pain and what you learn from telling the story. Well, certainly the shame like
Mhm,
decreases,
mhm,
and the being
yeah,
just being alone in it
mhm,
um decreases with the telling of it, um but it becomes something can that we can share with other people,
yeah, yeah.
and just um I hope you keep going
Yeah.
with
Well,
it.
thank you. I do. I think that the way we tell our stories is so powerful, and that's an interesting connection between writing and yeah, the work of sitting in a counseling office. And how do I tell my story? How do I see myself? Like your question about identity. Who am I? How do I describe that? And it's just it's oh, now they're calling for me. Okay, my husband's running interference now. It's all good. um yeah, I just think
Mom's doing writing stuff.
mom's doing something
Give
up
her
there.
space.
Who knows?
The
Yeah,
writer life. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. As you were talking, I was thinking about just like my favorite understanding of what the Bible is that it's a story. I mean, it's a set of rules and it's a love letter and it's so many things, but it's the story of God's redemptive work in the world, and the fact that we get to be part of that story that God is telling with the arc of the universe is just pretty fabulous.
Mm, yeah. Uh, who do you think you're becoming these days, like in this chapter?
Wow, that's an interesting question. Um, I would like to think that I am becoming someone who can speak the truth without fear.
Mm,
Um, I would like to think that I'm becoming someone who stays rooted in my own belovedness and can see the belovedness of others. I really hope, I mean, I still don't feel like very many people know who I am or whatever, but
mm,
even just going from like having 400 followers on Twitter to having 2,000 followers on Twitter, it's like, ooh, like I, I don't want to ever become a person who, like you were saying at the beginning, was this before or after we hit record?
mm,
Uh, that sense of being authentic wherever you are in any sphere. Um, I hope that I hope that more people read my writing, but I also hope that I can stay grounded and authentic and vulnerable, no matter how many people that is. And maybe it'll still only be a few people, and that's okay too.
mm. Yeah. Uh, I'm glad you mentioned Twitter. I was going to mention it. Intro or
Mhm.
post. Um, uh, Twitter is a dumpster fire, but if you need some positive refuge from the mess, follow Sarah on Twitter. Like I really appreciate you on Twitter, Sarah, because like you're one of the most like supportive people uh,
Mm,
on there,
mm,
and and one thing I like is that when you ask questions on there, like you're not just like doing it for show uh or just like but it's like you actually engage like
mhm.
you actually listen to the answers and
Yeah,
respond to the answers of the questions that you ask, so I
yeah.
really appreciate uh like you're one of the positive uh spot the bright spot on
Thank you.
Twitter.
I, I appreciate that. And it's a fine balance. And, sometimes I might have an off day on Twitter, but yeah, I'm trying to see it. I mean, I went on there because they told me to, right? It's like writers have to have a platform. You have to have this many followers, or we're not going to publish your book. But like, what a terrible way to see people. as a means to an end,
Mm.
like if
Mhm.
I need this many followers before, I mean, like, God forgive me when I see it that way. These are real people. And so I'm trying to just enjoy getting to know people. And I do. I like to respond when they give me I like to ask questions that elicit something positive about what it is to be human, and then I appreciate it when people give me answers. So I try to have time to respond.
Yeah, it's fun. The and uh, I think one of the things uh, that I like about the questions that you ask on Twitter is it it has helped me just consider like what are we going through,
Mhm. Yeah.
this last year.
Oh, it's been
Um,
tough.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So as we wind down our time for today, are there any last thoughts you have on for listeners?
Um, well, what the only thing that's coming to me is you haven't asked me about my book about racism, and so
Oh,
I want to talk about it just a little tiny bit.
yes.
So I I'm writing about one specific story um in 1851 in Oregon City, which is right around the corner from me. It's where the school is that your daughter goes and I teach. In 1851, there was a man named Jacob Vanderpool, and he operated a hotel in Oregon City, and he was black. And um, a, a rival hotel owner pressed charges because Oregon had these exclusion laws that said that black people weren't allowed to live there here. And he was convicted of being black, and they made him leave. And he's the only person in the history of the United States ever to be convicted solely of the crime of being black. And so,
Wow.
yeah, so that, like, knowing that that happened here in my backyard, it just kept going around and around. It was like, oh my gosh, like I have to wrestle with this somehow. Um, and as a white person, what is my response supposed to be? Um, and I started looking deeper into this story, and I started noticing. So there's not a lot about Jacob Vanderpool in the historical record. I mean, he sort of like shows up, he this happens to him, he disappears. We don't know where he was before that. We don't know what happened to him after that.
Mm.
But there are um, these white men who participated in this story, and they're all over the historical record because they're these Oregon pioneers, right? And so, like, we know a lot about these guys because they built Oregon. Um, and so the book, my working title for it is The Place They Made. I'm interested in looking at, like, who are these people who did this thing, and how is that the place they made, how is this place still that place? What's
Mm.
the legacy? And what do I do as a white person to repent of the racism that's in me, whether I want it to be there or not, because I live in this society? And what do I do about this past stuff that, I mean, I think there's a lot of white people, maybe even especially white Christians, who say, everybody stands individually before God, and you don't have to, you don't repent for something somebody else did. But I don't know. I don't know that that's biblical. And now I'm getting off into the weeds of theology, but I see in the Bible people repenting for their ancestors' sins. So those are the questions I'm asking, and I'm trying to figure it out. And that's a whole other topic. I'm just going to drop that on you at the very end, and then there you go. Make of
Well,
it what you will.
well, hopefully have you back on to talk a
Yeah,
little bit more about
yeah,
it. But the, quite the contrast,
yeah,
memoir, and then just like kind of investigative.
yes,
Yeah,
yeah.
historically. Yeah. So.
yeah, we'll see how it goes. I'm getting into it, but once again, I'm still writing stuff that I just want to write it, and I don't know if anybody wants to read it. So we'll see. Check back in. We'll see what happens. Yeah.
Yes. Well, so if listeners want to read what you have written, uh, how can they find you?
So I have a website, www.sarahlsanderson.com. I try to keep it updated with my list of everything, and that's probably the most succinct place to find it. I mean, I do put it on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, but that all gets buried in other stuff in between. So yeah, I try to keep the clips up there on Facebook, or sorry, on my website. Sometimes they go dead, the places disappear, and then I try to take them down or not. It's a weird world we live in. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll put your website in the show notes
Sounds good.
on YouTube, and then also on the podcast on Spotify.
Yeah.
Um,
Cool.
yeah. Thank you,
Thank you
Sarah.
so much. Yeah, this has been a joy. I enjoyed talking to you, and gosh, I feel like your counseling clients are lucky to have you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Um, Hope you have a great summer.
Thank you. You
Yeah.
too. Yeah. Yeah. I hope you guys have some fun plans and get to enjoy a little time off for your family members.
Yes. We'll see you around
Okay.
and on Twitter.
All right. Sounds
Okay.
good. See
Bye,
ya.
Sarah.
Bye.